Hello, everybody. I want to thank first the Embajada de España and the ambassador who invited us here and made this possible. Also, I wanted to thank the festival, the Anthology Festival, and talk about this thing which is think architecture, right? That was the topic that was given to us. So we did a little exercise in the office, a group of us, to start to think about architecture and what is important in architecture. So the topic that we are focusing is what are the cities in the future going to look like in 20 years from now? So you have there the 2040 cities. There's been a lot of sort of exploration and thinking about what the cities would be. Would they be underground? Would they be in Mars? Would they be sort of floating in the oceans? So the question now is the ecology, right? Ecology is an important aspect, an important influence on the architecture. Why is it so important? Because if we don't have an atmosphere, we won't be able to have cities. So what kind of city should we have? A city that actually produces oxygen as opposed to producing carbon. We have to think that we're producing 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. So what are we going to do to try to absorb this 40 billion tons, right? What kind of formula, holistic formula do we have, or what kind of equation, a logarithm, whatever you want to call it, but how are we going to try to absorb all this carbon, which is actually polluting and also contaminating and creating global warming? Well, there's different solutions, which are, I'm going to try to explain a little bit. They're at the very beginning, these solutions, we've been studying them for the last 10 years. The scientific community has been studying them for the last 10 years. And the architects and the urban planners around the world we're all kind of thinking about ecology as the primary narrative for our cities in the future. If we don't have an atmosphere, what would our cities look like, right? So that's the first thing. There's a list of ideas that I'm going to explain. And also then after that, I will tell you a little bit about my firm's story about this same theme of ecology and how 40 years ago, we already starting to think about ecology and think about planting in the buildings and how to transform things that are dead into things that are alive. So how to do that, right? So the first thing is that, well, Earth is calling us. Earth is telling us that we're in a critical moment. I mean, there's the panel of climate, which is telling us that we have 10, 12 years more. Now there's activists like Greta, which are sort of also being very vocal about it. But most of all, we have the real problem of the fires in Australia, the tragic situation of the ecosystems there, both the animal and the vegetation there, but also in Siberia during the summer there, we have a methane which is going into the atmosphere in devastating effects. So I just want to show you some horrible pictures of what can happen if we don't take care of this planet. As you can see, you all know these images, but I wanted to start with sort of this tragic moment in the sense that in architecture it's not all about design and beauty and graphics and all that. It's also about relating to the earth, to the Mother Earth. And the first organism that was alive in the earth, of course, we all know that the earth is 4 billion years, that the solar system is about 15 billion years. And about 3 billion years ago, there was this superorganism, which is called the oceans, and where through phytoplankton and through the absorption of carbon and the release of oxygen, the oceans made the atmosphere possible. So we have to know that 90% of the carbon that we're throwing into the atmosphere right now is going back into the sea. But the problem is that the seas are heating up, the seas are dying also, and that the top levels are not mixing with the bottom levels, which means that the top levels of the ocean are pretty much dying without fish, without phytoplankton, and eventually they won't be able to produce the oxygen and clean the mess that the human beings are producing. So you can see how the average temperature is actually going up. And the effects are not just only on the coral reefs and the sort of what everybody thinks that the fish are dying, but it actually has an effect on the atmosphere itself. And sometimes I look at these typhoons and these cyclones, and I'm thinking, well, it's the Earth itself that is trying to cool itself through this sort of rotating systems, which at the end are basically the heat, that is the energy, that is trapped in the sea, that somehow has to be released into the atmosphere. So would it be possible that these cyclones are actually cooling down the Earth in a way? So anyway, what are we going to do about it, right? So what are we going to do about, and this is why I think architecture, yes, but think architecture in the future, 20 years from now, what are the cities going to be looking like? Well, if we don't take care of it, unfortunately, what happened to Mars is that the atmosphere actually escaped from the planet. It's a question of the molecules of hydrogen actually being so light, they can actually escape into space. So if we are thinking about the future of the Earth, what I'm trying to avoid with this little sort of experiment of thinking about the future is a situation where we don't have an atmosphere anymore. And if we don't have an atmosphere anymore, we are basically in Mars. Basically, we cannot be outside. So our cities pretty much would look like a Mars base. So we would have to cultivate in them, we would have to live in them. So this is kind of a scary situation, and I think that we have to try to revert that. And being architects, knowing a little bit about geoengineering, a little bit about ecology, a little bit about planning, a little bit about city planning, we can safely say that our house is burning. But this is to sort of all the young guys that are here to think about this and to see what we can do. If we are doing business as usual and we're producing 40 billion tons of carbon a year and we don't cut emissions aggressively, well, it's going to be very difficult to avoid this greenhouse effect. So why is this related to architecture and to technology? Well, there's one thing which is called Geo Engineering, which is geo, of course, is Earth. We all know that from the Greek. Geo is geography, and Geo Engineering is trying to help the Earth with some engineering systems so that, for example, the oceans are full of oxygen and that they can actually move the phytoplankton. It can actually happen again. It can actually, we can revive the oxygens. On your screen, you can see a variation of solutions. Some of them are almost science fiction, but people like Elon Musk are actually thinking about them seriously. As you can see, you can actually put like panels up there in the atmosphere and actually reflect the light before it hits the Earth. Or you can, from the sea, you can put sulfur into the atmosphere and actually try to cool down the atmosphere. The second thing you can do is artificial trees. This sounds a little bit like Blade Runner or almost science fiction, but Harvard University and MIT are already experimenting with artificial leaves, which would capture 10 times more carbon and produce 10 times more oxygen. That's the one on the right of your screen. And on the white things over there, they're also called artificial trees. So you have artificial leaves and you have artificial trees. And what these artificial trees, which are right now pretty ugly, especially compared to their natural brothers, but what they do is that they capture CO2 and they produce oxygen. And that's going to eventually cool down the Earth if we can manage to do it. This is what I was telling you before. This is what Mr. Musk is working on, which is actually having like mirrors up there, which could reflect the sun out and don't get it trapped into the atmosphere. And not only that, but it could also be like a solar park that could create clean or green energy. So there's a few solutions, but there's also a lot of debate about this. Sometimes we talk about the smart cities, and we talk about what we can do as architects to deal with this, because cities and construction are creating about 30% of this carbon in the atmosphere. One thing that was lately investigated is concrete, which actually absorbs carbon and doesn't create more carbon. So this is one solution. Now, the cheapest way to deal with this whole big mess that we have created for ourselves is planting. Plants are definitely our best friends. So there's, of course, the Global Tree Restoration Program. Mr. Trump already said the other day he's going to plant 1 trillion trees, 1 trillion trees. But let's be a little bit more specific about this. Okay, anybody knows the surface of the Earth? How many square kilometers we have? Anybody? Anybody knows how many? Anybody knows how many million square kilometers does the planet have? Because it's limited, right? It's not a billion. No, it's 500 million square kilometers. Out of that, 361 is oceans. So that gives us only 150 million kilometers for the Earth, for the actual Earth. Out of that, we have about 40 million forests. We have about 28 million in deserts. The cities actually only occupy about 15 million. And then we have to, of course, plant to eat. So that's another 15 million. And sorry, I made a mistake here. The ice is 15 million and the cities is only 1.5 million. So after a rough calculation, which basically tries to see how much a tree can absorb, we calculated that with 16 billion acres of trees, we could absorb the 40 billion tons of CO2. Now, actually, we don't have that much land. We only have about 9 million square kilometers. So yes, with about 500 billion new trees, we could actually start working towards this potential solution to global weather change. I see in the Philippines, of course, it's important because the weather tends to be hot, but not only in the Philippines, the deserts are drying. I mean, there's problems all around the globe, as you know. So what can architects do to plan this? Well, architecture is not just making buildings. We also intervene in making cities, new cities, right? There's a population which is growing on the planet, and everybody deserves a house. But how to put these houses in the territory would be the main thing. I think that all architects from the Egyptian times, they all had nature in their mind, right? It's not like it's something new. Ecology might be a new word, but nature is not a new word. So I want to go through a little bit of what we did in the last 40 years to deal with this thing of how nature is integrated into the city and how is it integrated into architecture. This is a picture of our office. Our office on the left was an old cement factory, 150 years old. And this was a place to produce cement made of cement and with the only use of being a factory of cement. So my father, Ricardo, bought it and decided to transform it into some sort of garden or an oasis or a monastery where we could actually work. So that thing about form follows function, then all of a sudden was breaking that kind of equation. So a place which was basically dead and which was polluting the entire neighborhood actually became a place where we were planting on the roofs, we were planting on the facades, and we were doing a building which basically works without air conditioning because we're working with natural air currents. There's something called the Venturi effect, which means that and the Islamic culture was very good at that by putting the natural wind through water and then cooling the buildings in a natural way because, of course, air conditioning is also very old-fashioned in the present technology. So we have a factory on the left which is polluting an entire neighborhood and basically The place is called the Avenue of the Industry. There's no residential architecture. And by destroying the ugly parts and then planting or restoring the new parts, finally we did this sort of, I would call it an iconic landmark building, which is now, for those you guys that follow Instagram, it's pretty much there also. But the architecture inside doesn't need to be expensive or lavish. As you can see, we have some pieces of like rough bricks over there, and we call this arquitectura povera, poor architecture. Arquitectura povera meaning that you're just trying to use materials which are around 1 kilometer and that are very local, and that, of course, they don't produce a carbon footprint. So even the roofs were planted. We wanted to also to have orchards there. I mean, eventually, the whole neighborhood was changed through this one project, and now it's one of one place in Barcelona where we even have sports field. Even the players of Barça live there. The Barcelona players live there, which means basically that we went from an industrial place which is dead through planting to a place which is alive. So it's a little example, but it's an example that gives us a little bit of a model. Much before that, we had something which was called organic architecture. Now, organic architecture just means that the walls basically are curved, that we are copying nature. We all know Zaha Hadid, we all know Calatrava. They're inspired in nature, but they have no nature in the buildings. It's just, okay, you curve the wall, and it looks more like organic, but it's not organic. This is a house that that my father did 40 years ago, that actually follows the contours of the land. So it's organic architecture, it's vernacular architecture, it looks very local, but is it really something which is ecological? Well, this is another example in Calpe, in the south of Spain, where the relationship with nature was what we call biomimesis. Biology, life, and mimesis, copy. So you copy life, you copy nature. The rock on the right is called El Peñón de Ifac. It's a natural icon. And on the left is the building which is inspired on that shape. So this is another way to sort of be inspired by nature. Some of the plans, I knew that there was going to be some architects here, so we wanted to show the pre-CAD, the pre-parametric, before parametric architecture, before algorithms, before machine learning, before all this artificial intelligence. We had pencils, and we had simple ways of doing things which were also valid. So this is a building that was using cantilevers, and it was using this sort of very natural way of ventilating, these patios. And I was showing this because it's a little bit of the beginning of this influence of nature in architecture. Now, this is a building which is called Muralla Roja on the left, which also tries to sort of be influenced by the architecture of North Africa and South Spain, meaning that it's inspired from vernacular architecture. It's not inspired from the architecture of architects. It's inspired from the architecture of the people, of the villages, and it has some very interesting shapes. This is from Muralla Roja. You can see the Peñón de Ifac. And now this is quite interesting because it's a master plan. This is the master plan of Muralla Roja, which means that geometry, that with one square, with one cell, with one module, you could do actually a very interesting building. So this again is before we're using computers, but the result was pretty amazing. A lot of patios, of course, Spanish architecture, as well as Islamic architecture, is based on the idea of the central patio, and that's a way to cool down the house. It actually is Spanish or Roman architecture, I would say. So you have patios with different colors and a series of apartments that wrap around this sort of this residential architecture on the coast of Spain. I thought that I would show these buildings because, I mean, they are quite amazing in the sense that they were done so long ago, and they're still very, very relevant in terms of how they approach nature and how they approach the place where they were built. So near Barcelona, we did this, it's called Kafka's Castle. Today we were talking about the importance of narrative, of storytelling in architecture. From the very beginning, we try to give a name to our buildings before the developer gives it a stupid name, like the ones that we're using now. Like I have an Indian developer who calls my building El Dorado because I'm from Spain, so let's do El Dorado. Okay, fine. We need to feed our architects, we need to have work, right? But this was before that, in a period where it was a little bit more intellectual. And the name of this building is Kafka's Castle. Kafka's Castle in the sense, a castle which is magic, which is a place where you get lost, a place which is kind of surreal. And look at these master plans and look at these plans. If you are an architect, you will see how different they are from the plans that we're doing today. But it also has a biological reference in the sense that they're cells that are connected. So they create an organism. They create an organism. And sometimes I say that cities are like super organisms because every day food comes into the city and every day waste goes out of the city. So in that sense, it's like a human body. When we look at the result of these cell-making buildings, we can see that the result sometimes is not what we expected. So the result is part of a process that you try to establish at the very beginning. So some of the results of this architecture, which perhaps today is impossible to do because now we have so many laws and so many setbacks and so many developers that it becomes very difficult. Also, when you're doing mass housing or what they call now affordable housing, you can do things like this Gaudi district that we did in Reus, which is south of Barcelona. And again, these shapes which could remind us of amoebas or some sort of animals or even sort of like, strange shapes, always with the patios in the center and always trying, in this case, for example, to find the natural light, to have the light go into the building. Even if the site is very narrow, let's look for the natural light coming into the units. So there's a lot of articulation to try to find this. Now it's all about views, but before sunlight was extremely important. If you go to China or you go to Russia, all the buildings have to have 2.5 hours in every window of direct sunlight. So how does the country look? All our slabs looking south. You go to China, from the north to the south, it all looks the same. It's all buildings looking towards the south. That's a law that was in 1921, a law which was hygienic. It was all about everybody deserves some light, of course, but the result is that the architecture becomes extremely monotonous and the cities basically disappear. I'm still in the 70s now with all this sort of very, I would say, interesting architecture because it was done at the time for 30 euros per square meter. 30 euros per square meter, as you can imagine, is kind of low. But we were with a peseta at that time. We didn't have the euro, and we were working with the artisans themselves. We were working with the local colors. We were trying to experiment and to create buildings which would be a little bit different, but always using the local materials, which in this case is the brick, the Catalan brick, or the famous brick, which was actually a Roman invention. The brick was invented by the Romans, as well as cement. Now, if we look at the cities that we were imagining back then, of course influenced by Archigram, which is the famous movement that came from England, and it was all very futuristic. I mean, there's some plans, but it's all about cities in space, floating in space, as opposed to be rooted in the ground. So again, starting with a module, you have one module, everybody deserves one module, and then how to combine modules to create something that would be interesting. Interesting in the sense that you have space, you have urban space in the air. So that was our theory back then. And of course, a lot of geometry, a lot of combination and permutation, how to do this. And the fun thing is that actually some of these things got built. I mean, they look like, they don't look like they can be built, but you will see coming up soon how these buildings, which at the beginning were models and were experiments, this is a model of the city in Spain. Look at the experiment here, how you can actually jag the units up and down, and by jagging and moving the units, you can actually create like urban doors, urban windows. You can create something more than just a little window, a window with an urban scale. Now, this is the model that eventually became this building, which is Walden 7. Walden 7 was a building, again, done for 30 euros per square meter. It has 500 units. And the interesting thing about this project is that it has, you see these urban windows, these holes that actually allow air to go through the buildings and to cool down the building. So, you know, some small windows so you don't lose energy, and actually creating streets up there, and creating a rooftop which is not just a roof but also has like swimming pools and amenities for everybody. So what I was trying to say is that we went from this architecture of cells, and finally we could build it, even if it's something that I don't think can be done again. On the bottom of the picture, you can see the remains of the factory where we're actually working now. Some of the crazy sections that show that these buildings are actually empty in the interior, like almost like termite nests, and we were thinking that the termites are doing better buildings than the human beings. So let's look at nature a little bit and see what we can learn from nature. Some of the sections, this is again Walden. And Walden, as a city in space, has these corridors that sort of cross through these urban windows. And it's a community which was originally affordable housing, but finally it became sort of a much more upscale community, and again was transforming the neighborhood. So you can see how with one square you can do a very complicated structure just by the combination, the permutation of squares in space. And also, we're thinking about people should live in a different way, you know, not in the sort of middle-class bourgeois kind of environment with a kitchen and the foyer and all this sort of very conventional ways, but let's open up the space inside these units and make them very, very sort of free space. The kitchen becomes a living room, the bedroom becomes, so those are the ideals and the utopian ideals of that time. This is the same building, but the exterior streets through which you get to your unit using colors, the local colors that we associate with the Mediterranean, the colors of Earth, right, which are always, ecology is a word that I've used enough, but at least Earth-looking and natural. When you look at these buildings from a drone or from the air, you can see these swimming pools that I was talking about, the blues. You can see the patios, and you can see how it's all articulated in a way that it breathes like lungs, you know. So all the units here are actually very fresh, very cool, and you know, we're planting on top of the building. We're using the fifth facade or the roof to actually plant. Of course, it's not enough. Some of the geometries that are used to create this sort of big streets inside the building. There's a point where postmodernism starts to bring the idea that history is also part of architecture. And here you can see a building that is called the Small Cathedral, La Petite Cathédrale. This is where we're crossing the ideas of the modular architecture with the idea of a French Gothic cathedral. So in a sense, we're going from the utopian community to the city scale. Now I wanna jump a little bit in time and show you a little bit of the real ecological cities that we're doing. China is experimenting with this because they have a big problem with their atmosphere, which is very, very polluted. They have about 400 particles in the air, and they really need to replant the entire country, and they need to do cities which are actually producing oxygen, not producing carbon. Said this before, but I mean, this is the main idea of this lecture or this speech. This is Xiong'an, which is a city south of Beijing, where there's no cars, no carbon cars. It's all electrical. And The idea is to, with artificial intelligence and machine learning and all that, to create a laboratory so from here to study for the next 100 years what cities should be like. One of the principles was very, very simple. 80% of urban space, meaning streets, plazas, 80% of it has to be with tree cover, with mature tree cover. So, of course, if we can plant the streets and we can create this shadow, and we can create these cities which are very close to what a forest is doing, then cities won't be the cancer of the planet. Cities will be actually like forests. They will give us life, and they will give us a future which is not Mars. We have to do everything that we can, because there's a point in global warming where it's called a supercritical warming, and actually there's nothing we can do to stop the warming and to lose our atmosphere, meaning it goes forever. Some of the little drawings that we do before going into computers, we always like to draw by hand. And then, of course, you have what is called the renders, the sort of the CGI, or the computer-generated images. Some of the images of how you introduce water into these cities, and how you basically do cities which don't have humongous skyscrapers. After studying smart cities for a while, we thought that Manila has about 44,000 persons per square kilometer. Barcelona has 35. The ideal is about 20,000. 20,000 persons in a city, in a metropolis, per square kilometer. If you have 10,000, it's 1-to-1. The density is 1-to-1. If you have 20,000, the density is 2-to-1. If you're architects, you know that's called the FAR, right? The FSI, depending on the country you are. In this Chinese project, we had a density of 2. You cannot have 2 less of a density, because then it becomes a suburb. It becomes what we call the non-city, like the suburbs in America. They're very inefficient, because the pipes, the mechanical engineering that you need to get to that house, which is 20 kilometers from downtown, is going to be extremely expensive and not at all ecological. So you need density in the cities to create shadow in the streets, because normally if the street is 25 meters, the building by it should also be 25 meters, like in Barcelona, in Paris, in St. Petersburg. So there has to be a relationship between the width and the height of the buildings. So after quite a lot of exploration, we came to this density of about 2, so which is 20,000 people per square kilometer. We've done other Chinese projects very quickly, but essentially what you can see here in this street, now here I'm contradicting myself, because this building up there seems like very high. But anyway, what we're trying to do is make the streets livable, and make the planting of these streets very local. You try to put a palm tree in the Arctic, it's going to die. And if you try to put, you have to put the right plants in the right place, so these trees actually become mature. So this is the typical image now that we show for a project where we have an electrical car. They call them pods, P-O-D. And then you have a lot of engineered wood, which is normally like 80% pine and 20% resin. It can change depending on the brand. But essentially, we're looking for this architecture that would be not glass, and would be more ecological in feeling. Now, the smart city, the problem with the smart city is that it's humongous, right? How to do a smart city of like 7 kilometers by 20 kilometers. It's such a big infrastructure project that then we came up with a smart village, smart town. So it's smaller. Easier to do. So we decided with the Chinese government that we had to reduce the size, we had to reduce the ambition of this pilot smart city that they also call the intelligent city. It's a kind of a pretentious name, but intelligence refers to the fact that it has 5G, to the fact that it's also producing oxygen, to the fact that ecology first, and to the fact that the cars are all electrical. So here you can see a little bit of what we're trying to do, a scale which is human. Always we're talking about placemaking. placemaking not for machines, placemaking for humans. No, so we can think of the city as a place where the street is like the living room of your, or the corridor of your own house, right? In a house, you have a corridor, you have a living room. In the city, you have a street and you have a plaza, like we have here outside Intramuros. Actually, the Spanish were pretty good at planning cities, from Cuba to Santo Domingo to Manila. In Intramuros, you can see this very organized north-south, Cardos and Decumanos, a very simple way of doing cities. The English, instead of planning the cities, they let the cows roam around, and then where the cow goes, then they do the road. So nothing is straight, right? So everything is just basically planned by the cows. And America basically it's much of the same. You go to Los Angeles and it's like spaghetti urbanism, I call it, because it's such a big mess. And Manila would need a little bit more of that sort of rationality in the future master planning. So a lot about smart cities, drawing by hand at the same time that you're drawing with computers, and then trying to create spaces that are basically, again, ecological in the sense that they're comfortable. So either you're under a dome, you're under a pergola, or you're under trees, and that's when you call it the tree canopy. Tree canopies normally have 3 levels, like the palm tree, for example, is about 7 meters. Then you have something in about 3 meters, and then you have the shrubs. So you have 3 layers of landscape to create an ecosystem that makes sense. This is another project of a smart city, in a tropical smart city. That's why I wanted to bring this to Manila, because when you're in the tropics, it's much easier to plant trees and to have them grow. If you're in Saudi Arabia and you have to plant 1 million palm trees, well, every palm tree needs a drop of water, right? But if you're in the tropical sphere of the planet, then it's much more easy to plant those 500 million trees that we need to absorb those 40 billion tons of carbon that we're throwing out there into the atmosphere, as if we were not doing anything. Anyway, the relationship with the sea, the relationship with the city itself, and these buildings that try at least to be sort of human in scale. To do one building is not to do one sketch. You need to do one sketch about 100 times until you can get the sketch right, and then eventually you can get some sort of city which is logical and ecological. This is a project we did in Dallas, which was how to connect the downtown of Dallas to the Trinity River, and again through gardens and through nature, and through there there was some original prairies in Texas, in Dallas, and we tried to recover those the original DNA of those prairies and of those landscapes that had existed before urbanization. So you can see the spaghetti of freeways, very American, but we tried to connect the grid of the downtown, which had a Spanish origin, to the river. And that's the curve and the straight line meeting. Now, I'm about to go into a couple more details. What is this? This is what we call a smart crossing in a city. So you have public transport, you have bicycles, you have like trash, which is separated, if it's organic, if it's plastic, if it's glass. You have enough space that you can see the bus coming. You have pedestrian crossings, you have bicycle tracks, and also you have arcades. So you create a little bit of shadow for the people in the crossing. It's just one of the elements in a city. This is a very interesting project, and the first time that I heard the word smart city, and I'm like, I thought my phone is smart, and now the city is also smart. I thought it was a joke, but no, it was not a joke. It was the new trend in the world of urban design. Now, what you can see as a potato on top is actually old Moscow, which is 1,000 square kilometers. And what you can see as this sort of a leg going towards the southwest is the extension of Moscow that the president of Russia asked us to do. So how to connect the old city with a new extension through trees, through parks, through green belts, through rivers. And then we did this smart park, which was 80 kilometers long. Since Moscow had a river going in one direction, we thought, well, let's do in the other direction this 80-kilometer smart park that actually connects the city, not only for humans, but also for animals. You know, animals are also here with us. So if the animals have these barriers and these frontiers where they cannot move around, normally they go extinct. They go extinct, and that's going to be bad for a whole ecosystem. So I encourage you all to think about the city, not only the objects. Think about urban space. Think about the city, because the building is just a little thing in the city. So who cares about the building if the city is not going to survive or is not going to be interesting? So some of the images of these streets that we were proposing for Moscow. Here again, we have a density in this case of 1:1 for the residential parts. And then on the back, you can see a tower, which is the density is 1:3. So 1:3. So it doesn't mean that there's a solution for every city and that you have a formula. Every time you have to go to the place and really live in the place and then finally understand what kind of shapes you want to do in relationship with a river. For example, this one, I don't like it at all because it has nothing to do with the river. So, you know, we all make mistakes, we can learn from them, and that's the most important thing. In this project that I was telling you about, this is the new Kremlin. The Kremlin, you know, is where Mr. Putin is sitting. They told us, okay, put the Kremlin like 80 kilometers from the real Kremlin, and then instead of having a monocentric radial city, we will have a polycentric city, and therefore we will have less traffic problems. So we have two centers. That didn't work. It was nobody in the Kremlin wanted to leave the Kremlin. So yes, there's a lot of ideas, but then putting them into practice sometimes becomes close to impossible. But we have to keep trying. Now, back in the 80s, there was this idea of the pedestrian city. Let's get all the cars out of the city, put them underground or put them outside, and then create cities which are actually for people and that are actually for pedestrians. So this was an example of how you can do a city which is inspired, as you can see in this drawing on the left, this is a plaza, which is inspired in a flower, but which is done again with geometry which is quite mathematical in the sense that geometrical. And you create these plazas. And not only that, but we wanted to recover the classical language of architecture, but do it not for 30 euros per square meter this time, but for about 120. So how to do affordable housing, which has a facade and which has a human scale and which is also done with technology, meaning that it is done with precast or in situ, but basically with concrete elements which are done in a factory or that are poured on the site. So some of those examples of how we try to give a human dimension or a historical dimension to the cities. Now lately, it's kind of strange. Oops. Something happened. Yeah, you were right. Something went wrong. Okay. Can I have some assistance? Well, the ambassador told me that there was a glitch tonight. I think he planned it so I could get very nervous and actually fail in my attempt to do a good lecture. No, just kidding. It's very funny because Saudi Arabia, we all had an image that is a medieval sort of society and that they were not going to even deal with ecology and all that. And we find that they are very interested, and the new government is very interested in creating cities which are not dependent on fuel. So the country that is producing 15% of fossil gasoline for the world is actually very concerned about creating new cities. Now, what happens if you're in the desert, right? You're in the desert. In this case, you're in Morocco, and you have to do a university, which is like a city, small city. First, you have to do a master plan, right? You have to do a master plan that has squares, that has streets, that has planting, that has gardens. And then you have to use the local materials to build this, the local colors, the local materials. And then, well, there's no trees there, right? So we have to create some sort of pergola which actually absorbs the heat, and that helps us generate solar energy. I recommend you all architects to, when you work in Morocco, not to do the same building that you would do in Manila. When you're in Moscow, don't do the same building that you will do in Barcelona. So a lot of the interesting thing about architecture is that actually you have to change the way that you think about the projects every time. This is again a project in Al Hofuf, which is in Saudi Arabia, and here we had to plant 2 million palm trees and to also create that 80% cover of tree canopy. Again, we're trying to do a city. There's a mosque. This is Islamic culture. And architects, we have to be able to work with all sorts of religions, all sorts of cultures. You have to be able to adapt. But you have some principles, like the ones that I was trying to talk today, that should always remain there. The first one is ecology. The second one is mobility. Mobility is all about multimodal. So you start walking, then you go on a bicycle, then you go on a public bus, then finally you take a plane maybe, which is not very ecological, but I mean, it's multimodal. So you move through cities by changing the way of transport. This is something that we've been trying to do in Barcelona. And so you have ecology, you have mobility, you have infrastructure, and you have a few more principles that today I won't have time to talk about. A few of the gardens that we have done with a Mediterranean spirit, which is, of course, right by the Mediterranean. You have this very, very sort of strong elements like the cypress tree, the olive tree. This project is in Valencia. You can see it's dry. This is a river that was actually diverted. It was changed course, and the city asked us to do a park. So we transformed the dry riverbed into a green riverbed, and eventually this is right after construction, and now the center of the city, instead of being a dry spine, is a green spine. So this, you can see some of my Calatrava colleague back there also. But essentially we did the garden, and it's 12 kilometers long, and it really was one of our first ecological projects that I wanted to bring here today, and to explain that the biodiversity and the botanical scheme here was based on the local plants, the palm trees, the cypress trees, and the olive trees. You have pergolas, you have walkways, you have a way to create shadow. And then when we move now to Holland, I just wanted, we've done this family of mine. My grandfather started like 90 years ago. Now he's up there. My father is still working at 80 years old. So I'm showing you a little bit of projects that go throughout these few decades. This one is one in Holland, where you cannot build more than 5 levels. Holland is pretty much a horizontal country, but we were allowed to do this little landmark tower. But most importantly, we did this garden for the people. So the garden for the people that mixes this classical architecture with this modern architecture. I see the 5 minutes here, so I'm gonna go a little bit quick. Now, this is another project in Madrid. There was a river, or there is a river called Manzanares, and it was polluted. Not only the water, but it was full of dumps of trash. So there were mountains of trash that we transformed into mountains where the people could actually go up there and look at the city. So even trash can be transformed into nature. And this is this mountain that below has all this trash. And what happens is that you have these little chimneys where the methane that is burning inside with the trash, as it's compacted through time, actually can burn out. This is Manzanares Park, and that green pyramid there before was trash. And to finish, I want to invite you all to Barcelona. And to invite you all to Barcelona, this is a presentation of the gateway of Barcelona, which is the airport that we did. While Madrid was spending 6,000 euros per square meter, here we did it for about 2,000. And how to do that? Well, try to reduce the impact of your engineering. For example, this roof is extremely simple. So what I want to do with this last picture is invite you all to Barcelona. I think Spain and the Philippines have more than 300 years of history, and I want to thank everybody, and especially the ambassador of Spain and the festival for inviting us here and giving us the opportunity to explain a few things about the city and the future. Thank you very much.